I just told Ron that he is now an official member of the Nameless Lay Group. And actually, we have, there's another alumni of the Nameless Lay Group out here. Sherry, where are you? Are you there? Yes, there she is. We were a group, actually we were multi-generational, but the core was a group of young adult disciples. Some of us were from converts from evangelicalism. Some of us were cradle Catholics. What we had in common was our hunger to follow Christ as disciples in the midst of his church. And I can still remember there was a real turning point for me. Father Michael Sweeney, who was the Dominican pastor of Blessed Sacrament Church, basically one day he was with us, and I can't even remember the context anymore, but he turned to us, and he at one moment, and he just said to us, "You are the evidence my priesthood is bearing fruit." And I remember my first honest response was, he's talking like he's a person. I mean, who knew priests were people, right? I was so new, and I come from a fight and fundamentalist background, so there was no category in my background for dealing with Catholic priests. And it really was stunning to discover that he didn't know. I thought, but you're a Dominican, you're a priest, you're supposed to know, don't you? And it was amazing me to realize he was looking to see if his priesthood was bearing fruit, and he understood that the church teaches that the fruit we are to bear is to see other disciples and apostles arising around us. That is the ultimate fruit. He was really talking about the priestly office of governance. But I had no idea in those days. But that word has really struck with me. And it is true for all of us. Most of us here are not priests. But to whatever extent you and I are involved in the church's life, in the church's mission of catechesis, of evangelization, we are participating in the same pastoral office by delegation from our pastor, from our bishop, but nevertheless, formal, informal, whether you've got a title, whether you've got a salary, whether you've got anything official at all, it doesn't matter. There's only one pastoral office of Christ, and to the extent that you are doing something recognized in your parish or your diocese, you participate in your own way. So it is true for all of us. What is the ultimate sign that your ministry, your vocation, your work, whatever it is bearing fruit? Is the emergence of new disciples and apostles around you. Everything else, all this wonderful stuff we do, and I know it is very important. All the children you get through sacramental prep, all the people you get through RCIA and to Easter, all the children that you give religious education to, all the youth groups you run, all the campus ministries that you are part of, all that is the administration, the programs, the structures are important, but they are important because they lead to the one end. We are not here to keep the ecclesial trains running on time. Even though a lot of us, that's what we spend most of our time doing, right? That's what we feel like. But what is the end? The end is new disciples and apostles arising around us. Now, a few things from the book. I will not bore you with all the statistics that make everybody depressed. Okay, I've been told all over the world how depressing that first chapter is. That's fine. I just want to revisit a couple of really important things. One is religious identity is fluid in our time. We live in a culture that does not support inherited religious faith. It actually penalizes religious groups, not just Catholics, but any religious group that depends upon inherited religious faith. And it actually benefits, interestingly enough, it actually benefits groups that actively evangelize. So we need to understand that is the world we are living in. The majority of U.S. adults have left the faith of their childhood at some point, not just Catholics, any faith, including, interestingly enough, adults who were raised without a faith will leave no faith. The majority of adults raised without a faith will choose one as a young adult. All that means is everybody feels it's like a rite of passage. It's part of becoming a young adult. You choose your love, you choose your work, and you choose your faith or lack thereof. It's all part of defining yourself. This is the new cultural norm. So even though you and I may have done fantastic job raising our children in the faith, we've been faithful and fabulous catechists and religious educators and parents and youth ministers, when they get to be young adults, they will probably revisit it anyway. It is, please do not feel you have failed. That is not what is going on. Now they are saying, now I have to decide whether it is my own. Now, this is brand new. This is not in your handouts. It just came out 2 days before I left to come here. So I stuck it in. But what's fascinating about this, these are new figures from CARE, which is the Center for Research in the Applied Apostolate. And basically, for one thing, they estimate the number of people, of Americans who thought they were Catholic at some point in their life is much larger than we knew. Over 100 million people in our country considered themselves to be Catholic at some point in their life. And of that number, over 40 million have dropped the identity. I'm sorry, 32 million. There's 32 million former Catholics in this country. And there's another 10 million who hold on to the identity but aren't registered anywhere. So we don't even know they exist. So there's about 40 million people that we sort of kind of went off our radar, that we lost, so to speak. Imagine being so big you can lose 40 million people. But that's what so that they are part of it. When we talk about, when you do those, like in October, they do those, surveys of who comes to Mass, and then the diocese reports it. Usually what we're doing is comparing who's there to the number of people who are actually registered. But that represents only about 60% of Catholics, of people who consider themselves Catholic at some point in their life. So, and about 24%, they said, of Catholics who we know of, okay, of the 76 million Americans who say they are Catholic, 24% of them are at Mass on Sunday. They would say, I go every Sunday. So we've got, by most standards, in a lot of countries that I've worked in, we have a lot of active people. I'm telling you, in Australia, in England, in Ireland, they would love to have our numbers or anything even close to it at Mass. And yet, compared to the number of people who we baptized at some point, the majority, of course, are not here. Now, so as we said, choosing your faith has now become normative, and the fastest growing population you've heard of are nuns, right? Not N-U-N-S, right? But N-O-N-E. I come from the land of none. I'm from Seattle, Washington. We are famous for our practical agnosticism. 60% of Seattleites, if you ask them if they're part of a religious tradition, they will tell you no. And I don't mean Christian, I mean anything. Okay, so we're famously the land of none. That was even I actually came across a tourist magazine that wrote an article about Seattle, the land of none. So it's part of our tourist identity now. That along with coffee, latte land, and all that stuff. Okay, and rain. So we had this large number of people who are now dropping all religious identities. Who are they? They're primarily the people who only had a name but never practiced. What is happening is the people who kept the identity but never darkened the door are dropping the identity. Because there's no point for it anymore. There's no need. There's no value for it in their life. They don't see any purpose, so they just drop it. That is what is happening. It's the non-practicing mostly that are doing that. Now, there was an amazing, really helpful study that came out in Canada after the book was published. So this is not in there. But what I loved about it is they looked at young adults who'd been raised in a Christian faith, mainline Protestant, evangelical Protestant, Catholic, across Canada, and they said, who stayed? Who is still there practicing as a young adult? They found there were 4 basic things. First of all, young adults who said they had experienced God's presence and they had seen answered prayer. In other words, they had a real encounter. They saw evidence of a living God. That was a very important factor. They had been able to ask and discuss their real spiritual questions within the Christian community. They understood, they had a chance to wrestle with the gospel story, with the kerygma, with the great story of Jesus in real depth and what it meant for them. And they have seen communities, they had older adults in their life, maybe their parents, maybe other people, but older adults who were living lives of discipleship around them. If these 4 things were true, they were there. And if they weren't, they were gone. And what's really important to look at is these are not primarily doctrinal issues. It isn't about the church's teaching in the sense that often we think of it. It's about seeing it lived, having a living encounter with Christ, seeing other people who are living it, being able to wrestle with the real implications for real life, and encountering Jesus. If that was true, they were there. They were bucking the culture because they had a reason to. That was personal and that really meant something to them. And that is the really big issue. That's one of the things that most people tell me, the one statistic that just makes people crazy. Bishops, everybody, they say that statistic. That the majority, that actually a majority of American Catholics are not certain they can have a personal relationship with God. And when I found that myself, I was stunned. I could not take it in. That only 48% of American Catholic adults could say they were certain. They didn't say they had a relationship with God. They just were certain it was possible. No wonder so few of us ever talk about our understanding of God with anybody else. I mean, American Catholics are less likely to talk about it than American atheists are. But if you don't know there's a personal God, and the younger you are, the less likely you are to believe this, why would you talk about it? Now, the majority of Catholics, here's our issue. Here's where we are. We have a majority who actually don't know that personal relationship with God is possible. And this is exactly what St. John Paul, the Great, was saying in Catechesis in our time. He said, many Catholics are still without that explicit personal attachment to Jesus Christ. They only have the capacity to believe. Think about that. Capacity to believe placed within them by baptism and the presence of the Holy Spirit. That's what baptism gives us, the capacity. But are we using the capacity? Now, this is really interesting. My husband we live in Colorado, right? We live 7,000 feet in the Rocky Mountains, which means we have thin air and you have fat air here. I just want to point that out to you. Time I come down to the lowlands, and I breathe the air and I think, boy, that's fat. It's just filled with oxygen, all right? My husband is an Uber athlete, and Colorado tends to draw people like that. Basically, the lack of oxygen, and all of a sudden you become very irrational, and you do things, like you run 100 miles across the Continental Divide between 9,000 and 12,000 feet high in 30 hours, and you don't sleep. It's called the Leadville 100. It happens every summer in August, and my husband has done it. He did it in 28:30, okay? But, all kinds of stuff. So literally the day before I come here, it was so funny. He turns to me, he says, there's this one weekend this summer that I'm really trying to decide what to do. I said, fine. He says, one of the things I'm really drawn to is up in Lake Tahoe. They have in that long weekend, I guess Labor Day weekend, you can run 3 marathons 3 days in a row. So what I mean is you do one day, a second the next day, a third, right? So 3 in a row. And if you do 3 in a row, you run all the way around the lake. He says, oh, I want to do that. And of course, I looked at him and said, Jim, not even you can run 3 marathons in a row without any training. Because my husband's idea of being fit, most of us might say, what are we shooting for? We're shooting for, if I could just, run around the block, or if I, run a mile or something. My husband's idea of being fit is if he decides to run a marathon tomorrow, he can. And with a good time and finish, right? Okay. So he thinks this is normal. My husband not only has the capacity to do these things, he's actually done it. I only have the capacity. I have 2 legs and they work. But you are never going to see me running 3 marathons 3 days in a row. And that is the difference, okay? The church distinguishes between the virtue of faith, which is the capacity given to us at baptism and by the presence of the Holy Spirit, and the personal act of faith. That means I have given my personal that personal yes to a personal Lord. Our children, our teens, and our adults have received the first. But how many of us have been asked, have been called, have been given the opportunity, or even know that it's important to do the second? That is the issue before us. Now, I think you all recognize him. Building trust since 2013. All these dire statistics I've been sharing with you, and I want to share you something that's truly, truly amazing. This was a Canadian study that came out in March. I was stunned when I found it. They'd studied Catholics, lapsed or non-practicing Catholics in the U.S., the U.K., and in Canada. And they found that in each of those nations, a significant number of lapsed Catholics said they were reconsidering their relationship with the Catholic Church, and 75% of them said it was because of Pope Francis. Americans were the biggest group that responded. 26% said they were reconsidering. If you do the math, that's like 14 million people. And that runs about 800 persons per parish. I just want you to stop for a moment. Pastors, do not panic. Okay, don't panic. It's okay. DREs, RCA leaders, do not panic. But I just want you to envision 800 people showing up at your door. Okay, sure, we'll do it. No worries. Right? Or maybe, how about just 200? Okay, just 200. Think about it. It's funny when I share this, it's like nobody else, it's out there, but nobody else picks up on it. I don't know why. God is doing something new. That's what we're seeing all over the country. Everyone I've talked to in the last couple of years, and I've talked to a lot of people, very well-known evangelizers all over the country, and we're all seeing the same thing. Something has changed. The climate is changing. God is doing something new, and Catholics are now open in a way that we have never seen. And then we get the great bridge builder. A man who is apparently gifted by God to rebuild the bridges of trust in millions of people at once. But the question is, who's going to help them walk across the bridges? Because that's the job of the disciples and the apostles in that place. That's our job. As evangelizers, we need to attend to 3 concurrent journeys. We talk about this in the book. But we've spent most of our time and energy looking at where are people, of course, sacramentally. What are their needs? Are they baptized? Have they been confirmed? Et cetera, marriage issues, all of that. And are they active? Are they here or are they not? And how active are they? But the first journey is the one we have not been attending to. And that is the one that determines how fruitful the second and third journeys will be. We need to pay attention to all of them. Where are they in their lived relationship with God? That is the critical journey that, for whatever reason, we just haven't been spending our time looking at. We need all 3 of them. In our Making Disciples seminars, from which the book Forming Intentional Disciples came, I talk about 3 stages of adult Christian development. And this is we teach this in the seminar. It's not in the book. So this is something you will not have probably heard. It's really simple. We've just found it incredibly helpful over the years. We talk about seeker, disciple, and apostle. Partly we started doing it because our Making Disciples seminars were aimed only at leaders and pastors. We had vicar generals, and we had pastors, and we had DREs, and we had diocesan staff and parish staff, and RCIA team leaders, all leaders. And we discovered that many of them had no sense that there was supposed to be growth in the Christian life. It was just pretty much, you were there, you'd received your sacraments, you showed up, and what more was there? So we started using this to kind of help them see it. Now, the seeker stage is everything from maybe I don't even believe in God, or if I do, why should I care? Through that whole journey to I am now an intentional disciple of Jesus Christ, seeking to follow him in the midst of his church. That's the journey that the book entirely deals with. I don't go beyond, as you probably all noticed. I stop where they make the great decision to drop their nets and begin to follow Christ as a disciple in the midst of his church. That was deliberate because this was the stage we weren't talking about. This was the stage we realized when we dealt with 1,600 leaders from 60 different dioceses in these workshops over the years, that most of the leaders didn't even know this stage existed. They leapt right over it. So we actually basically gutted what we were doing when we realized the problem. Basically what happened is about 10 years ago, we had one of these workshops going, and 2 days into it, we asked the leaders to go into small groups, parish groups, and talk about where their spiritual seekers were in their parish. And the team scattered around to listen in. And what was stunning is none of them talked about where their spiritual seekers were, though we had just spent 2 days about identifying spiritual seekers. You know what they talked about? How many people did and did not come to their programs. That was it. And the whole team came together during lunch by ourselves, and we kind of looked at each other. And we gutted. We took at what we were doing, and it was great stuff, but we gutted 85% of it and started from scratch because we realized the beginning was not there, not in their imagination. It wasn't just that they weren't doing it. It was literally they didn't even know it existed. And we had to somehow help them get an understanding of this most basic foundation of wherever you start, that journey toward conscious, deliberate, intentional discipleship. That's what we mean by seeker. We use the image of dropping your net, as a lot of you know. That's because we also discovered we better get something, some image to them that was scriptural, so that it became concrete. And so we use Jesus coming on the Sea of Galilee. He's meeting Peter and Andrew there, and he says, "Come follow me." And the scripture says they left their nets, they dropped their nets, and they followed him. So we call it dropping your net. And it's been fascinating. Since we did that, since the book has come out, one pastor read it, and he was, pastor of an incredibly dynamic parish. He was certain they were doing a great job of evangelism, but he read the book and realized he had a lot of people who had not quite dropped their nets yet. So what they did, they had a youth conference, they had a youth retreat actually coming up in a couple of weeks. They changed everything on that retreat, and they made it 24/7 Eucharistic adoration. They had a few presentations, but it was mostly encounter. And they gave every one of their kids a cheap fishing net. And the story is that one of the adults who was volunteering was in the Eucharistic chapel in the middle of the night, and there was a 15-year-old teen on his knees in front of the Blessed Sacrament with his fishing net in his hand. And as the night wore on, she said he moved up. He kept moving closer and closer on his knees to Jesus. And then suddenly he threw his net to the ground. And she said the hair on the back of her neck went up because she knew he knew what that meant. It was just the beginning, of course. But it was a very, very important moment where he had gone from having the capacity to believe to making the personal act of faith. It was going to take the rest of his life, of course, to become a saint. And that's true for all of us. But at least we've begun the journey. Now, often in the early days when we talked about intentional discipleship, and we still get this, it's really interesting. People say, "Why do you mean intentional?" We've been accused, we've been told this is Protestant, this is elitist, this is judgmental. Who basically gave you a right to look into the souls of your fellow Catholics and somehow judge them and all this kind of stuff, which of course we're not doing at all. But my question is, but how do we do the rest of adult life? I mean, how did you get here? Did you just wake up in Steubenville? You rolled out of bed and found yourself at the conference? I mean, did you roll out of bed one morning and find yourself married? Well, maybe. Okay, one or two of you. Sorry I asked. I'm sorry. Okay. But most of us don't do it that way, all right? We know what intentionality means in every other area of our life because you have to be intentional to live as an adult, right? To get a job, to hold a job, to cook, to pay your rent, to pay your mortgage, to take care of your children. And yet somehow when we start talking about faith, I don't know what, it all becomes very mysterious. We don't want to talk about that. Intentional just means deliberate, conscious, that we are consciously seeking to follow Jesus Christ as his disciple, not accidentally, not in our sleep, deliberately. And that is what we're called. He called Peter and Andrew to that. He is calling us to that. Will we deliberately drop our nets? Nobody drops their nets accidentally. Nobody gives over control of their future, their livelihood, their identity, their economic well-being, everything, and offers it in order to follow Jesus. But disciples do. So it isn't accidental. What we have actually found out, we call it the don't ask, don't tell culture. There is a culture, a de facto culture of silence in most parishes that actually suppresses the expression of discipleship. We have disciples. This is exciting news. We have discovered we have disciples in our parishes we don't know about. You know why? Because when the culture begins to change and they feel safe, they come out of the shadows. That's what we're seeing. When parishes start to evangelize, they start talking about this openly, the hidden disciples feel safe and they come out. Because a lot of them are actually suppressing their discipleship to fit in at the parish level. We've had people tell us, literally, I felt like I was betraying my Catholic faith by being a disciple. Somehow they got the impression, I don't know how, that it was not Catholic, it wasn't valid. And it's almost like some secret they wanted to hide. But when that changes, and we're seeing it start to change in parishes all over the country, amazing things start to happen. Not only do the disciples that are in residence start to manifest themselves, start to come out of the shadows and make themselves visible, but you know what? The spiritual seekers will discover, they will show up at your doorstep. Every parish we work with grows, because at least a quarter of the American adult population at any moment is actually spiritually looking for alternatives. We know this from all the studies. They're either actively looking or they're at least passively looking around the horizon and saying, is there anything interesting out there? And if they hear that your parish is a place where people can have these conversations, they show up at your door. We are not used to thinking of that, but we are seeing it happen in parishes that actively evangelize. If we don't change the culture, the reason a lot of our people don't know that personal relationship with God is possible is not because it's not deliberate. It's not like anybody's intentionally doing this. They picked up this idea because they didn't see anyone around them talking about it or living it. And most of us don't think about things we've never heard anybody else talk about. So when the culture changes, that changes. Now, the disciple stage. Somebody has dropped their nets. They're beginning the journey of living as a disciple. Okay, what kind of happens? And this is very brief. I'm not attempting to, deal with this exhaustively. But in this very early stage, this is the time in the just before discipleship and just afterwards, this is when catechesis comes into its own. Now people are actively hungry. They're looking. They're asking the questions that catechesis is intended to answer. And so you do not have the situation where a lot of us have faced that we're offering really good stuff, the riches of the church to people, and we have this sense it just rolls right off. It doesn't penetrate at all. It's not because they're not intelligent or anything. It's because they aren't ready for it developmentally. It's like we're teaching physics to kindergartners. It's not these kids aren't smart. They may be brilliant. They may be geniuses. But at 5, you're not ready for college physics yet. You have to grow. And now when somebody has made that commitment, they have that personal act of faith, they have dropped their nets, now the catechesis, they'll just suck it in and they will want more and more. They will come to you. What disciples ask of us is totally different than what we're used to. You have a parish full of disciples, they will clamor for formation. They will fill every class in the parish, in the diocese. They will demand, they will clamor for discernment. They want to discern personal vocation. They want to know what God wants of them. Disciples give. Disciples serve. Disciples pray. Disciples worship. They are dying to pass their faith on to their children. You don't have to beg them to do it. And all of this wells up out of that encounter. So catechesis becomes hugely important in support in those early days of being disciples. One of the things we've also discovered, and we didn't know this, there's a lot of things we didn't know, we're learning as we go, is that many people cannot be active evangelizers out in the world until they've had a certain level of maturity as a disciple. I don't mean we're not talking that they have to be fully mature, that they're saints or anything, but just they need to feel stable and rooted in the faith before they're comfortable going public with it in hostile or in different circumstances. Maybe with their family, maybe at work, maybe with friends who don't understand. There's a certain development that has to happen before they can do that. So the whole mission of evangelization is dependent in many ways upon the number of our people who reach that level of maturity. And one other thing we found is the gift discernment process. How many people here are familiar with or have been through a called and gifted? I'm just curious. Okay, a number of you. The called and gifted workshop is, and discernment process is what we're best known for. We've been doing it, I've been doing it for 20 years. It's helping Catholics discern how they've been gifted by God for the sake of others, to discern the charisms that they were given in baptism, with the Holy Spirit and the call that comes with that. And so we've had probably about 80,000 people Catholics around the world who've been through this discernment process in the last 20 years. And so we've found one of the things that really we didn't know is that kind of discernment helps people who are disciples move to the next level, which is, I'm moving from being someone who is seeking to follow Christ, who is sitting at his feet and learning from him, and now I'm moving to being an apostle, which is someone who is sent by Christ in his name with a mission on his behalf. I know when we think of the word apostle, of course, we think of the 12. We also think of the bishops, the apostolic succession. But the church also uses that word and has historically to refer to all other kinds of apostles. And in fact, you've probably heard the word apostolate, right? And they talk about the lay apostolate, et cetera. It's in the Vatican II documents. Apostolate, the definition of the word apostolate is the work of an apostle. Okay? Someone who is sent, a small a apostle, someone who is sent by Jesus Christ. One of the debates at the council was every baptized person anointed for a mission, and did we all get charisms? This was actually debated in the context of the discussion on the decree on the laity, because that was where the real topic was. So that is, in fact, the teaching of the church. But to make it real to the average Catholic, we have found there's something very amazing about helping people identify a time in their life where they were used by God in the life of someone else. And if they see that, if they can identify a single experience, then all of a sudden something happens. It's like the penny drops and they go, everything changes. Because now it's not just theory, this is real. There really is someone out there who is waiting for what I have been given to give, and it matters that I say yes. Their life hangs in the balance, and it matters that I say yes. And they get that, as one woman said to me, I've been Catholic. She said, I'm 52 years old. I've been to 12 years of Catholic school and 4 years of Catholic college, and how come I've never heard this before? It was debated at the council, but it's taking a long time to filter down to the grassroots where most of us live. But the called and gifted, we found, really helps people make that transition to I'm a sent one. As one woman said to me, she said, I used to feel that I was unworthy to kiss the sandals of Jesus. And now you tell me that I put them on and I walk like they fit, that I stand in his place with my daughter, with my friends, with the people I work with, that I stand in his, we talk about it vicariously, not that she is Christ, but she stands in his place vicariously. It's part of what being an apostle is. She said, this changes everything. And that's what we find. All of a sudden, they get this idea that I have a critical role in the mission of the church that I need to discern. And this becomes a living. And so people move into what we call apostleship. That's sort of a stance, which is a stance. You know, it's just an attitude toward life. I'm a sent one. I'm not just here to receive, I am also here to give. People's priority change, as I said. We see this all over the place. If you evangelize, everything changes. And it has huge implications in the areas of stewardship, mass attendance, creativity, evangelization, vocations. I mean, for years and years on my blog, I kept saying things like, do you want vocations? Make disciples. Do you want funds? Do you want stewardship? Make disciples. Do you want people hungry to attend your classes? Do you want Franciscan University to be filled to the brim? Make disciples. Do you want this conference to have 1,200 people in it? Make disciples. Because it is that encounter that sets a fire inside that changes people's priorities and makes them so hungry, and everything else changes but it's out of a living relationship. As we said, a lot of our people don't even know that is possible. The last stage that we talk about is the apostle stage. And this is, I think, what Pope Francis was talking about when he says missionary disciple. What's a missionary disciple? It's someone who's a disciple who knows they are sent, who's going outward, who's looking outward. Now I know I'm responsible for the mission of the church. One of the issues about this, at this developmental level, this is where people, A, discern personal vocation of all kinds, including priestly and religious vocation. And this is where the lay apostolate, that is the mission to evangelize cultures and structures, which is primarily the responsibility of the laity, it's at this level of personal development that is accomplished, that lay apostles who have moved to this level are the ones who will be wrestling with how do I go into the world and transform it so that it fosters all that is of God, all that is truly human, which is also part of evangelization. This is the issue. I would estimate, and this is just loose, I mean, it's just my personal guess. There's no studies on this. There's no definitive figures of any kind. So just hear it as my, loose guess at this point, based on 20 years of helping Catholics discern their calls. I would estimate that about 1% of all Catholics have reached that developmental stage. And that is our primary vocational problem. It is not that we don't have vocations. We have as many vocations as we have baptized people. What we don't have are baptized people who have been called to discipleship, who have been helped to grow in their relationship with Christ, in their faith, and integrate it into their whole life till they get to the point where they can really discern a call. That's what we have. We have a shortage of discerners, not a shortage of vocations. It is really dependent on the number of our community who reach this developmental stage. Now, one last thing, and then I have one last little thing to share with you that isn't on a slide. This is not only true of individuals, the seeker, disciple, apostle sort of pattern, it's also true of communities, parishes. So let's look at it again. Seeker, disciple, apostle. Think of the spiritual norm of your parish. Does this make sense what I'm talking about? I don't mean a lot of our parishes, we have disciples, individual disciples, little clusters of them popping up in our parishes all the time. Even the grimmest, seemingly most spiritually dead parish. One of the parishes, one of our leaders works with, they used to call it Our Lady, Queen of the Living Dead. And that pretty much summed it up, okay? It's no longer Our Lady, Queen of the Dead, Living Dead, because amazing things are going on there. But that's what it was when they started. But even if you happen to be attending the sister of Our Lady, Queen of the Living Dead, okay, in there are bound to be disciples somewhere. Maybe you don't know who they are. Maybe, they're playing it cool. They're not making it visible, but they're there. But the overall culture of the parish is another question. The spiritual norms. How do you figure out what the spiritual norms of a parish are? Violate them. You break the unwritten rules, and all of a sudden you quickly find out what the rules really are, don't you? Okay? Well, think about this. So far in our experience, and we must be getting close to working, we're coming on 500 different parishes now in 130 dioceses. About 100,000 people. In our experience to this point, the average culture, overall culture of an average diocesan parish, and I mean, there's many exceptions. We know some incredibly dynamic parishes, okay, that this would not be true of. But I just mean an ordinary parish that has no association with any movements or anything special. Do you know what I mean? Just a standard, middle-of-the-road diocesan parish. Typically, the spiritual norm of the community as a whole is at one of the very earliest stages of spiritual development, the earliest and most passive levels of spiritual development. And if you've read the book, or if you heard me this morning, that corresponds with the threshold of trust. Okay? The culture, not only are most of our individuals there, but the overall culture is there. So it's at the very early stages of seeking. That's the norm. The cultural norm of an average, nothing particularly special evangelical congregation is usually right around early discipleship. It's not because they're saints. It's not because God loves them more. They're not better than we are. They're not smarter than we are. But they do know that there's a conversation that needs to be had. They don't know much, but they know that. And I can say that because that's my world. Those are my people. That's where I come from. Early stages, that's the norm. Why do half of Catholics who leave the church end up in the Protestant world? Do you know that it's like two tracks? Half become nothing and half become Protestant. Those are the two places Catholics typically go when they leave. The half who become Protestant are the ones who say, my spiritual needs weren't being met in the Catholic Church. Overwhelmingly, that's their number one reason. Why? They go there because they know at least there we can ask those questions. One of my friends who was working in a very well-to-do parish, in 1 month, it was fascinating, she told me in 1 month she had 6 different people, totally unrelated to each other, who came to her one at a time and all said the same thing: I'm about to leave the parish for the evangelical megachurch down the road. And when she asked them why, they all said, well, it's like, I don't know, something's happening. I have all these questions, and maybe I'm having a mystical experience, or God's doing something, and I can't identify anyone in our parish to talk to about it. Fortunately, somehow word had gotten out you could talk to her. She was able to talk for the 6 in disdain. It wasn't rocket science. It didn't require magic. All they needed was somebody who understood what they were talking about and could connect them to someone in the parish who could walk with them. And they stayed. It was that simple. But these people had to figure out who to go to. They had to hear, hey, you're going to go talk to her. Okay? It shouldn't be a secret. So, it is not, however, necessary that Catholic parishes be down at the earliest stages. We have met parishes, including the one that I write about in Forming Intentional Disciples, that it really is at mature discipleship and early apostleship as a communal norm. Now, they have amazing apostles in that parish at all levels. Religious apostles, lay apostles, priestly apostles. I mean, it's staggering. This is a parish that had 30 guys have already been ordained. That was 2 years ago. And they had 20 more in seminary. And two of the guys that I met who are in high school and thinking about seminary, I just found out, okay, they're both in seminary now, right? It was like a production line. One parish of 900 families. 900 families. And they had sisters, and they had brothers, and they had amazing lay apostolates, and they had incredible social apostolates and works of mercy. And I won't even bore you about their giving. Oh, it doesn't bore you. Oh, I see. That's interesting. Okay. No, truly, it was one of the amazing stories. They had an African bishop who came and preached there. And he mentioned the night before they were having dinner, he said, I've got a problem in that my cathedral burned down, and I need to get $65,000 to rebuild it. Now, $65,000 hardly buys a car, and a really expensive car in the U.S., much less build a cathedral. But in Africa, you can do this in certain parts. He needed $65,000. And so the pastor said, hey, we've got 2 masses. You preach at it, and we'll take up an offering for you. And during the services the next morning, the pastor actually stopped the mass, and he said, would you be willing as a congregation, if we don't make the $65,000 in this offering, that we take money out of our rainy day fund to make up for the part that is missing? And the congregation voted unanimously right there on the spot to do it. That bishop went home with $65,000, rebuilt his cathedral. I have seen it online. It's very simple, but it's there. And the rainy day fund was repaid in 2 weeks. And this is normal there. We don't know. Talk about it is normal. There's it is normals for individuals, and there's it is normal for parishes. And we do not know what normal looks like. That is what normal looks like when the majority of your people are deliberate, intentional disciples. And it's the communal norm. And there's no reason your parish and my parish cannot be moving in that direction. One last thing I'm going to share. There was 400 years ago, in a situation very much like our own, 50 years after a council. Well, this happens to be the Council of Trent, not Vatican II. But 50 years after a council, and after 38 years of religious civil war. And that may sound familiar. Of course, this civil war was very serious because millions of people actually died in it. In France, a generation of disciple friends arose who said, God basically wants something done about this. Historians call them the generation of saints. Francis de Sales, St. Vincent de Paul, Louise de Marillac, Jean de Chantal. Those are just some of the most famous members. But there were tens of thousands of people involved in this renewal. They prayed for each other. They worked together. They were co-founders. They mentored one another. They consulted with each other. They shared their experiences with each other. They learned from each other. They played off each other. They stole from each other ideas and, great ideas. And you know what? They changed the course of France for 150 years. And accidentally, in passing, they invented many of the things we now think of as immemorial traditional Catholicism, like the seminary, like the Catholic school system, like retreat houses for lay people. And they faced a situation, they inherited a situation much, much, much grimmer than ours. 20% of the population of Paris died in a religious siege. It doesn't get much worse than that. But they picked themselves up, and what God did through them, and it was really a couple of generations, changed not only the course of France and the church there, but changed the church around the world, because most of Catholic missionary work also came out of the revival. The city of Montreal, Canada, was founded by members of the revival to be a missionary outpost to Native Americans. Most of us have no idea of this history. But I think God is asking us to be a generation of saints in our time. 21st century, we've just come out of decades of conflict within the church. 50 years after a council. And he's saying, will you let me do it again? None of us can do this as individuals, but together. We have to say yes to Christ personally, absolutely. We have to follow him ourselves as disciples in the midst of his church. But what if we followed him as disciples together? What if we became the generation of saints here in the United States in the 21st century? What if we said yes together? And we asked God to do through us what he did through the original generation of saints. I think that really is what is before us. The culture, the spiritual climate is changing in our midst. We have Pope Francis, who is just preaching evangelization and mission. We have in the U.S., we have amazing resources. Everywhere I go in the world, people say, they say the U.S. is 20 years ahead of us. We are so aware of our own problems, you do not understand how the rest of the world looks at us in envy. But will we do it? Will you and I together, collaborating together, praying for one another, in our own, with our distinct charisms, our distinct offices, our distinct vocations? It's collaboration isn't about being the same. It's about the power of bringing our uniqueness to the table together in a common mission and laying our lives down together that Christ might pass through us into the world. And then you and I, someday they will write about us and they will say that was the second generation of saints.